Hi folks, one writing habit that saves me significant time is spending an hour or so doing preliminary research before I commit to writing about a specific topic. There are several ways to do so. One is to run a search in Google and see what results turn up. Google has several advantages. It's easy to access, you can almost always find something, and you'll often find types of resources or perspectives that you hadn't thought to consider. But Google searches have some limitations too. One is the sheer number of results that most searches return. Working through just a significant portion can take a long time. Another problem is determining the credibility of the results you get. In this age of deepfakes and disinformation, finding reliable information on Google, especially about controversial topics, is often challenging, unless you already know something about the subject or the sources of the information. Let's imagine we are writing a 10-page paper on climate change and want to ensure there is enough evidence to support our paper. We run a Google search for climate change and find 4.8 billion results. Working through even a single % of those results would take a long time. Much of the information comes from credible sources. These, for instance, are all from generally well-regarded outlets. But sprinkled among these credible sources are ones we need to be more careful about. Here, for example, is a source on climate change from PragerU. The first few seconds of the presentation make it seem credible. Watch.
Hubris is a Greek word that means dangerously overconfident. Based on my research, hubris fairly describes our current response to the issue of climate change. Here's what many people believe. 1. The planet is warming catastrophically.
Steve Koonin, who served as Undersecretary for Science in the Obama administration, seems like a reasonable person to listen to on science. He has impeccable credentials and is well prepared to speak about his subject. However, important questions arise if we do a bit of digging. First, PragerU is itself a problematic source. We can begin with its name. Although it calls itself a university, PragerU falls well short of the definition. It has no online or virtual campus, no faculty, tenured or contracted, and no students. What it does have is pundits sharing opinions. And setting aside the problem of its name, PragerU often takes a relaxed approach to accuracy. Though I would not advise using Wikipedia as a reliable source, its entry about PragerU cites 4 articles that have detailed how PragerU presents misinformation about climate change and other topics. Second, although Koonin is well-educated and informed, there are problems with many of his claims in this video. Very few are wrong, but many are misleading. You might still choose to use the resources from PragerU, but you need to do quite a bit of research to uncover the bias that the source contains. A more efficient way to do quick preliminary research is to use the school library. There will still be bias in the sources and debate between them, which is a simple consequence of working with controversial topics. But the facts presented, the reasoning employed, and the interpretive frameworks used are much more likely to be credible than the facts, reasoning, and interpretive frameworks found through internet searches. Let's compare what we find if we run a search for climate change on the library website with what we found on Google. At 2.5 million results, we still have far more than we can reasonably work through, but it is orders of magnitude fewer than we find on the Google search. Additionally, we have options for limiting our results by resource type and date, which can help us to gather useful sources. And if we ever run into trouble or have a question about a search on the library website, we can reach out to a professional for help. How then do you do the preliminary research? The process is straightforward. I suggest you do both a Google search and a search through the library database. Begin with the library search. It offers some features not commonly found in internet searches. Let me walk you through the process. First, we need to decide on some parameters for our search. These depend on our understanding of the topic and our audience. For instance, if we're writing about computer technology, we'd want to ensure our search results go back only a few years unless we were specifically interested in a historical perspective. Computers change so much that the information from as little as 10 years ago will often be obsolete. Then we think about our audience. What sort of sources are they likely to find credible? If it's an academic audience, for instance, peer-reviewed journals are more likely to sway them than other types of sources are. Still, drawing from more than one type of source is usually a good idea. And we want to make sure that the emphasis falls where it is most beneficial. We configure the search parameters by first going to the library website and typing in our search term. In this case, we're using the phrase climate change. Then we use the sidebar to make the selections we want. We start by entering the date range, and then we'll set the types of sources we are looking for. In this case, articles. Now we review our results. If we're satisfied, we can either start saving sources, an excellent idea if you see something you particularly like. The library database allows us to save information about sources and download that information later. Be careful though. These list of sources will disappear if you close the web page. So I usually copy and paste the information into a document I've set to autosave, or write the title and author on a piece of paper. In any case, we can be confident that we'll find adequate support for our paper once we start researching in earnest. Sometimes the preliminary search reveals that our topic is too broad. We can use the subject dropdown on the side menu to refine our search terms further. Some topics, like climate change, will have many possible subtopics, and other topics will have fewer. You can stack subtopics so that the results will be about both, but be careful. Stacking subtopics can lead to an overly narrow pool, though it doesn't in this case. Ideally, you'll want to be able to pick from 20 to 30 pieces of research directly related to your topic when you sit down to write a 10-page paper. To find those sources, you'll typically need to start with a pool that's at least 10 times larger than that number. We'll talk about how to sort through those sources later in the class. Speaking of the paper, let's assume we try to narrow the search by adding the subcategories agriculture and technology. We are interested in articles published in the last 12 years, but we find that we've made our search too narrow and we aren't finding sources that look promising, so we remove the subcategory agriculture. Having settled on our topic, we can then search for that topic on Google. Google has an advanced search feature, just like the library. One useful option is to limit searches by the last time the page was updated. You can also search for certain types of media, say images or video. Though the internet being what it is, filtering results on Google is less predictable than filtering your results on the school's library's webpage. I'd like to tell you that there is a specific sequence to follow when researching that will always lead you where you want to go, but unfortunately that doesn't exist. Research is a process. Changing one search element may require you to change others. That's why it takes a couple of hours to do an effective preliminary search. However you do them and whichever sources you decide to use, an hour or two spent doing preliminary research can save you enormous amounts of time and frustration down the line. It's a bit like going over your supplies before you go camping. If you make sure that you start out with appropriate food, clothing, shelter, and other supplies for the specific area and season where you'll be camping, you're going to have a much better time than if you rush out the door to find out after you've arrived at the campsite that the weather is 30 degrees warmer than you planned for and the local wildlife frequently steals your food. So in short, remember, do a little preliminary research. You'll save yourself time. Please let me know if you have any questions. Cheers.